last week in Hill Country here in Texas, there was some of the worst flooding in decades that happened in the Hill Country. And this is a disaster that, of course, has been widely covered. And we wanted to recognize and reflect on those who perished and their families and send our thoughts and our prayers and love to all those impacted by the storms and who are still deep in recovery and grief. As climate change continues to worsen, events like this become more common, and it prompts conversations as we're currently having nationally regarding our ability to adapt, our ability to predict such disasters, to better prepare for such disasters. And in the coming weeks, we'll discuss more about strategies to ever increase the safety and security of our cities, towns, and municipalities as we try to navigate a more hectic, more violent, and more unpredictable climate. For today's show, we are going back in time and we're thinking about an anniversary that just came up, which is the 15-year capping of the BP oil spill wellhead. And what that means is 15 years ago, the BP oil spill, Deepwater Horizon disaster, leaked millions of gallons of crude oil directly into the Gulf of Mexico. And as that occurred, it took weeks, it took months to understand and eventually stop that leak from continuing to relinquish oil from deep under the earth. And so today we're thinking about both the legacy of that event, but also the ongoing ramifications, much of which we don't know, much of which we're still learning and pausing to reflect on another environmental disaster, and one of the largest in scale ever, and certainly within many of our lifetimes. And I'm sitting down to think about how we process that and how we understand and advocate for ever more resilient and safe methods of manufacturing our energy systems and developing a better, healthier world for all of us to protect ourselves, especially here on the Gulf Coast. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio and Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. My guest today is a biologist by training. He is also a professional artist, and he thinks very deeply about how to put those two things into conversation through STEM plus arts education, but also on how we can pause to understand science's impact on the world around us, how to make our world a little bit healthier through science, and how we educate folks through the arts, how we can reach and approach conversations that otherwise would be impossible to have through different medium. And so today I'm delighted to welcome Brandon Ballengée onto the program. Brandon Ballengée, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for our audience who isn't as familiar with your work, I think you're a really fascinating person personally, but also, in this, you're an artist, you're a biologist, you think really deeply about science and art, and actually putting the two together. Can you just introduce our audience to your work a little bit and your background, because it's a really fascinating background.
Oh, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Yes, as you said, I'm a visual artist and a biologist, also environmental educator, and my wife and I run a STEAM education center in South Central Louisiana, and a nature reserve called Atelier de la Nature, where we do kind of interdisciplinary work between art, science, and education, and try to get people inspired about conservation and the ecology of the very special place of the world we live in, South Louisiana. Um, so my background is pretty mixed. Growing up, I grew up in Central Ohio and East Tennessee, and I
I'm gonna
always
say I
had a
thought you grew up outside the Gulf Coast, but then you've
yeah,
been here for many, many years now.
almost 10 years. Yeah. And so growing up, I always had a fascination with biodiversity. loving love for animals and particularly amphibians and fishes and invertebrates, and always found myself with a struggle between wanting to draw and depict them and also wanting to put them in aquariums and understand how to breed them and what kind of
Mm.
ecosystems they needed, and then eventually trying to learn more about the environments that I found them in. So I was always really drawn to both art and biology. And so for me, it's always been a question of, well, how academically initially could I do that through a degree program? And then eventually professionally, how could I do both of those things? And I guess after doing this almost 30 years, I'm still trying to figure it out.
As many folks with the non-conventional careers are, yeah, always adapting. But I mean, we're here to really today to talk about the BP oil spill, which we're coming up right now on the 15th anniversary of the capping of the disaster. We talked earlier in the year about the 15th anniversary of the explosion, the Deepwater Horizon disaster itself. But in thinking of those months that it actually took to cap that well to stop the flow of oil into the Gulf, at the wellhead, we're now coming up on that anniversary of the many months that it took to get to that point. And I think that's an interesting place to kind of pick up your work, which you've thought deeply. You've lived in communities who were deeply impacted by the spill for a long time, and you've thought through your art and then also through your work as a scientist really deeply around what the long-term consequences of that spill are. So maybe that's a good point to begin, is just what was maybe we started at the beginning of the story of where were you for the spill, and how did that impact your thinking and where you were in life and time, and the immediate kind of response.
Yes, I mean, I have a very vivid memory of being in London, watching the oil spill going on live
Mm.
in a coffee shop, and just thinking, oh, I really can't wait to get back and head to the Gulf and see if there's anything I could do to help. At the time, I was working on my graduate PhD work on amphibians as indicators of water quality in complicated agricultural landscapes in Middle England and southern Quebec. So inevitably what happened is when I did finally make it back to the US, I started coming down and volunteering to do as much as I could, whether that was rescuing birds or trying to help with cleanup efforts. Inevitably, I never rescued a single bird, but I did collect a lot of preserved specimens, a lot of dead
Yeah.
specimens following the spill, which I then preserved and later used to create an art installation called Collapse. Um, but I think for me, what really struck is being on the ground during the spill, just the impact to not only the ecosystem, the environment, but the emotion of how it impacted communities and seeing people first, fisher folk for the first time, and shrimpers and families so connected to this beautiful, amazing environment, how that impact just was felt and is still being felt, and how many of those family seafood companies just disappeared. And then we're still 15 years later trying to understand the ecology. So eventually in 2016, my family and I moved to Louisiana and I started a postdoc at LSU and shifted from working on amphibians to working on fishes.
Mm.
And one of the first things we wanted to do is try to have a 5 year look at what we could see from recorded records of collection of fishes in natural history collections. So
Mhm.
using online models, looking at online resources such as there are two different databases we pulled from to see what had been collected and where it ended up in natural history collections.
Mhm.
First of all, one of the first things that we thought of is, well, we know endemic fishes in the Gulf of Mexico. At that point, we said there were.
What do you mean by endemic fishes for folks who aren't familiar?
So an endemic species is a species that's found in one place and nowhere else on the planet,
Yeah, so we're talking about, creatures that are only in the Gulf of Mexico.
only in the Gulf of Mexico, only through, and sometimes some of these species have only been collected once, which is really interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
Are we consider quite rare. But you can see that, I mean, endemic species all over the world. In this case, in the Gulf, we have 78 at the time we said 78 endemic species. We've now since described another one, but we went through these records and we noticed that out of those endemics, there were several that were missing
Mm,
since Deepwater Horizon. And that's what we really started. So we created, well, not only the scientific research paper that went to peer review, but then we created wanted posters and then started to
mm,
do this citizen science outreach to try to get shrimpers and fisher folk to help us look for these missing fish. But for example, there was a wanted poster that had a picture of each one of the fish, kind of in this kind of silly, Western style wanted reward with the fishes on it. But it was effective. Like we made several hundred of those posters, distributed them from as far as the Florida Keys all the way across the western coast of Texas. So at different marinas, and then they spread online. And as a result, people did start taking photos of some of the fish, and which then
mm.
we encouraged them to put some of that data on iNaturalist. Some people collected specimens for us, and as a result, we were able to find some of the missing species. So that was a kind of an interesting experiment to see how we could try to involve the community in this search, but also a way to continue the dialogue with the community about how we are still trying to figure out the impact of that oil spill. So that was starting in 2016. And
Yeah.
then so around that time, worked with a whole team of artists and scientists to create a portable natural history museum and out of 19th century sea chests, which then I would travel around with these 19th century sea chests, open it up, and there would be preserved fish inside and deep sea
Mm.
isopods, artwork. And then I would encourage people to make art to kind of describe a little bit about their experience with Deepwater Horizon, also their experience with some of the different biodiversity in the Gulf. And then that was another great way to kind of break the ice. Instead of a scientist showing up saying, "Hi, I'd really like to find out what you're catching." I could show up as an artist or as an educator and say, "Look, I brought these really great specimens. Tell me your stories. I've got stories. I want to hear your stories." And that was an amazing kind of way to really kind of get to know community members. And then also then they would feel often like they wanted to contribute to the museum by giving specimens to or artifacts or drawings. And so that what was called the Crude Life Portable Museum traveled around the Gulf states for about 5 years while we were looking for the missing fish.
So before we dive further into the specimens and the kind of art piece of this, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit. I mean, you're starting at kind of 2016, so several years after the disaster itself, and really thinking already about what have we not seen, what have we maybe lost, which I also want to point out. Those 15 species you mentioned, you said several have been cited since, but several have still never been seen again to this day, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess to go backwards a little bit, before starting the postdoc and actually solidifying that idea of the missing fish through the science research, back in 2010 and 11 and 12, a group of scientists and I, or at least an artwork was created in scientific collaboration with several other biologists, called Collapse, which was recently shown
Yeah,
at
I
the
want to I want to hold you on that. Sorry. I want to
Okay,
focus for a minute and talk a little bit just about. I want to get to that. I do. But I want to
okay.
focus for a minute on the actual things that what is the impact that we continue to see, because you're really quite knee deep in thinking long term about what those ongoing kind of ramifications of this disaster are. And so, we're at this kind of 15-year mark. And I think for a lot of people, when that well cap was capped, when that leak seemed to be plugged, that was kind of the end of the story. And we're 15 years on now, and I'm curious if you can talk a little more just about what are some of the things we've seen ecologically, culturally, even. I mean, you're hinting at, those real impacts you saw in the early years talking to shrimpers and fisher folk. But I'm curious about what you think in 15 years this oil spill has done, and what do we still not know? How much are we still seeing? I think you've also thought a lot. I've seen in your artwork, but also in your kind of research. We've gone back to this spill and we've seen where there are still leaks happening, right? And we can see where there's still oil that remains in the Gulf from this. So can you contextualize a little bit some of just
Sure. I
yeah.
mean, Well, that's just it. I mean, 15 years later, and we're still just starting to scratch the surface to understand the impacts. There's still a lot of scientific research that's coming out, but that's to go backwards a little bit, this idea that a lot of people thought that the oil spill had just been done, that it was all
Yeah.
complete. I mean, this was by design. This is like a huge public relation campaign, I think, that BP put together to try to get this out of sight and out of mind as quickly as possible. And also, in addition, I mean, we also had the Obama and his President Obama at the time and his family coming down to the Gulf and going swimming and kind of just
Mm,
saying business as usual, when in fact, at that same period, people were still on the ground getting oil, picking it up, finding dead sea turtles, finding deformed dolphins and sea life. And so even in 2012, there was still quite a bit of impact, but it had really kind of evaporated from the mindset intentionally. There was this tremendous public relations campaign to kind of get business started as usual again and kind of forget that this spill happened. When research wise, I mean, as you said, 15 years later, we're still trying to put the pieces together to understand the full impact if we ever will be able to. So I don't know if this has been covered in previous episodes, but the decision when the spill happened to use chemical dispersants to sink
mm,
the oil, what's called Corexit, there were two different products that were used. These essentially took the fatty molecules of the oil, which would float in
mhm,
water, break them apart into smaller particulates, and then they would sink. So the thing is, this kind of then almost soaped heavy oil came to the bottom of the Gulf where it was basically impossible to clean. So we're still trying to determine just the footprint of the spill
yeah.
and kind of how life has come back. There's some evidence that the use of dispersants made the oil upwards of 52% more toxic,
Mm,
meaning that it couldn't be broken down. I mean, thinking about the Gulf of Mexico as a major environment with all these different types of ecosystems and microorganisms that
mhm,
have evolved to naturally consume oil. So the Gulf is rich with these deposits of oil,
mm,
basically. So as they do naturally, they seep. And at those seeps, microorganisms have learned to break them down. One of the unfortunate sides to using chemical dispersants, as I said, it makes it more toxic. So it
mhm,
slows the natural breakdown process. There is some evidence now that some microbes have evolved a resistance to these dispersants. So oil cleanup is happening naturally,
mhm,
but we're also talking about it at a very, very slow pace because of instead of being at surface in marshlands where we could solidly remove it, and in warmer, sunnier weather where things would be happening at a much metabolically at a much faster rate. It's happening at really deep levels of of the Gulf where it's cold and turbulent. So that's also slowing down the natural process of decomposition. Um, so having said all that, we still don't know like the fate of some of that oil. We don't know how long it will take for the oil to naturally kind of be collected and removed by these microorganisms. And we're still trying to understand the impact on deep sea ecosystems, especially like deep sea coral reefs.
yeah. So, I mean, I think, for context here, about 5 million gallons of oil was ultimately recovered, but that's out of, millions, like 134 million gallons or something, that was leaked, and that number varies. But I mean, the point is, we're thinking here, you know, at most, like the most generous estimate I think you can come up with is about maybe 5% of that oil was like really recovered in the initial period. Um, and so, I mean, I think that's a question of folks don't think I think we understand to some extent, like we didn't get all the oil. A lot of it probably kind of went into the ocean and then got redistributed. But I mean, in that context, as you're breaking this down, that, slowly this is getting re matriculated throughout the system. How long do we think this is there? How much do we think is still in the Gulf? Do we have any conception of these kind of? Yeah, okay. I'm seeing you
No, not that I
shake your
know of.
head, but we're in radio, so I'll let
Yeah,
you talk.
Yeah, I mean there have been several different studies to try to estimate fate of oil, but even how widespread or how far reaching it was, and some of the estimates say that the kind of contaminated site itself is somewhere between the site of Rhode Island and the size of Texas. So
Mm,
if that gives you a degree of uncertainty.
yeah.
And then there also there's some evidence that the oil itself entered the Gulf food chain or entered the Gulf Stream, and of course also entered the Gulf food chain. So the fate of the
Yeah.
oil spread through migratory species and natural migration of water and pathways. There's also some evidence that oil was found as far south as the Yucatan and
Wow.
as only up to the Carolinas. So really trying to map out how widespread that one incident was is an incredible task. And then understanding kind of what happens as that oil dissipates through different types of ecosystems, different types of organisms, we really don't know. What we do know is more research is needed to better understand this. Even looking at Exxon Valdez, they're still looking at research there to try to understand that
Mhm.
long-term impact. And this is a much, much larger spill and in a much more complex nursery ecosystem for lots and lots of organisms. I mean, the Gulf is such a vibrant and resilient environment with just um, numbers of species we still don't even know.
Yeah, I mean it's funny. It's not funny, but it's interesting that you bring up Exxon Valdez. I have such strong memories of that period and the aftermath when the CNN or Fox News ticker would be airing just the live coverage of the spill releasing oil. And I remember reporters on the news talking in terms of how many Exxon Valdez's we were up to, that it became a kind of unit of measurement for the Gulf spill, which is just disturbing
But
in
it's
different
also the
ways.
same idea that why the oil was sank. I mean, if visually, if you could see the oil, you could see the fires, you could see the booms, you could see the collection, that was something that proved that it was still there. But the decision to sink it and then after
Mm.
the capping, the just to make it ignore was intentional. It was an economic decision to I think lessen liability, which I don't think worked in their favor. It meant that instead of acknowledging the fact that no one had ever dealt with a spill of this scale in human history, and realizing that mistakes were made, trying to kind of sweep it under the rug just made, I think, a lot more apprehension with citizens in the Gulf and certainly in Louisiana, but all over the Gulf states.
Well, and the flip side of some of what you're pointing to as well is, I mean, it certainly was a lot of the decision making was driven very explicitly by economic concerns from people on the ground as well. You mentioning the fact that the Obamas came down to show off being in the water was a direct result of, tourism industries. It's a major driver of economic activity from Florida to Texas. And that kind of vote of confidence of come back to the beaches, this is safe. Similarly, our fisher folk who are so core to so many coastal economies. I mean, so many places I can think of in southern Louisiana, that is the economy. I mean, it is going out and fishing and shrimping. Um, and so there was certainly a push. And if you weren't involved in shrimping and fishing, you were an offshore worker, which that desire to get offshore drilling back in the Gulf, back up and running, all of these things, were really from locals along the coast, major drivers, and understandably, people, felt like their entire economic livelihoods were under threat. And so it's fascinating to me, and where I do want to go back to collapse now, that you're doing this really fascinating art piece. It's traveled, I think, every year since you created it. It's been on display in different places around the country. It just finished up a residency at the Galveston Art Center, and I wanted to give some of the context of the spill and this like long aftermath, both to just talk a little bit about the fact, we're at the 15th anniversary. It's a good time to talk about it, but also this immense event happened. This, incredible amount of oil still exists. We really don't know all of the long-term repercussions as you're suggesting. And it's not something I think that we talk all that much about in our day to day. In many ways, and in having worked on a large piece dedicated to the kind of 15th anniversary earlier this year, and working with a number of collaborators, really kind of realizing, especially for younger folks, I mean, they don't even really remember it, or they have like vague memories of this 15 years on. And so I was excited to see Collapse, but I'd also love to hear some, and it helped me think about ways that we can continue to think through and, I mean, bring to life, which is macabre given the piece, as you'll talk about, but bring to life, this ongoing impact that exists from something that I think for a lot of people in the public imaginary is kind of buried in the past. So with all that, let's dive into Collapse a little bit. And can you just tell us about how this piece originated and describe it for us a little bit?
Well, the artwork itself is a pyramid display of over 26,000 preserved specimens, Gulf specimens, collected in part during the spill, after the spill, and then through citizen science interactions. Folks living in the Gulf, finding things at markets, sending them to my gallery in New York. Um, it's stacked in a way so that it represents a memorial. It looks a bit like a pyramid, so you can see through its glass jars with preserved specimens. So the light is quite powerful. Uh, it's stacked glass upon glass, so the jars are stacked upon glass and upon glass. There are also empty jars, which then represented what we were already thinking might occur in terms of missing species, but also they represented unknowns.
Mm,
So there's kind of empty jars throughout to kind of, add this kind of question and what the viewer fills in with those blanks. There is a guide. So if one were to want to try to identify some of the species, there is a guide to do it, but it's really not meant as a didactic display.
hmm
It's inspired by research studies that were happening in 2010, 11, and early in 2012. But as you said, memory already by 2012, people had forgotten about the spill. So in New
mm.
York, my gallery at the time, which was Ronald Feldman Fine Arts, um, really took a chance showing a piece like this. I mean, it's essentially this huge work with preserved specimens on glass that stands like 13 feet tall and is 15 by 15 feet wide. It
Takes
takes
up
a
a big room. I saw it in Galveston. I mean, it owned a big room.
and it was this is a kind of work that had, the gallery Feldman was always kind of at the cutting edge of contemporary art and experimental art, but they'd never, I think, in their history done anything with this, certainly not this many preserved specimens
Yeah.
in one space. And as you said, the impact. So, and then also the idea that there's in all likelihood a piece like this cannot be sold easily to a collector. So it was really a challenge
You don't think
or
it'll be a popular piece for the kitchen table? I mean,
yeah, yeah, yes. Um,
you need a very
so
big kitchen table.
very big kitchen table. So in other words, the Feldmans really took a chance on this work, and I think they were really pleased to see the response. So the fact that we could show something in New York also meant that it was a pipeline for information coming from Gulf states
Mm,
to a totally different audience. So Collapse was shown, that was created, as I said, with three other scientific collaboration with three other biologists really as advisors
mm,
to help with the food chain component and also to help me identify some of the different species. And that was Todd Gardner, Dr. Todd Gardner, Jack Rudlow in Florida, and Peter Warney, who was in New York at the time. So those folks all helped with the pragmatic side and then also aesthetically the decision making. Really, I wanted it to be an aesthetic experience. So as you're looking, your eye is caught by color and shape and movement. It's again informed by a food chain and the kind of interconnected web, but I also like the idea that people can't see everything. So even though it's 26,000 specimens and nearly 400 species, that's less than 3% of what we know lives in the Gulf.
mm,
So just the amount of biodiversity there that we know about is incredible, but all that we don't know is remarkable as well. So that was part of the inspiration to hopefully get people inspired to think about that. But also importantly, included in the installation are shrimp that had oil staining that were showing up in markets in Louisiana, also shrimp that were collected in Alabama that had oil in them and lesions, and then also oil that was used in a court case in 2012, so right before the peace. So showing evidence that the oil was still very prominent that moment in history. So anyway, that piece was shown. In addition to that, we created a slideshow or a video presentation where people from the Gulf were asked to submit images of what they were seeing on their beaches or their local ecosystems as a way to just give presence and tell their own story in whatever means. And at that point, there were people that were showing up with these huge rashes that had been exposed to some of the chemical dispersants. Also, as I said, we mentioned the dead turtles and dead sea life that was still showing up. So it was a way for people to feel they could talk outside of their normal perimeters to have a wider audience. There was also a piece where we dissected 10 of the BP advertisements, and we
Hmm.
went through line by line, and found scientific evidence discrediting what was being said in the advertisements.
Hmm.
And we put all of this online. There was a cease and desist letter that occurred to the gallery, which the gallery moved forward. They were like, great, that means your art is um, an amazing thing that happened as a byproduct of the exhibition in 2012 at Feldman is the piece was there. A lot of folks from the Gulf got to come up and visit, and so that created this whole dialogue with a different community. Um, Initially, the exhibition was reviewed in two or three art journals,
Mm.
and it was reviewed in the New York Times, and then suddenly an article about, and the oil spill was mentioned in all of these, and the ongoing impacts of the spill was mentioned in each one of these articles. Then more articles started to percolate about the oil spill in New York to the point that Senator Bill Nelson from Florida made an appointment to come see the exhibition, and we were able to prepare a dossier for him of scientific findings at that moment in history. So we're talking about like um, probably about June of 2012. And
Mm.
so Bill Nelson is the senator that was the leading senator against the liability case with BP. So in some way, I like to think that we like to think that all of the folks that contributed to that exhibition and those installations and those pieces had a voice with that senator, and and hopefully help to change his opinion to go on and really try to help get justice for some of the communities in the Gulf. So yes, that piece has continued to travel since 2012. So it's been at National Academies in DC, which was really great, and a number of venues. So bringing it to Galveston was really special. I've always wanted to bring it to the Gulf states most of all. So that was the first time it's been shown in Texas. It's been in Louisiana twice, which is
Mm.
really remarkable too, and Florida. Hopefully, it'll continue to travel to the Gulf states because it's every time we show the piece, survivors or friends of survivors or people that work in the oil and gas industry have a story to tell, and the piece is not about making anyone feel guilty for who they're employed, how they drove here. It's really just to have this memorial and use this as a place to generate discourse. Like, how can we have conversations about what happened, not forget what happened, make sure that those memories stay alive, and then try to project where we want to be in the future?
What do some of those conversations look like? I'm curious if there are moments that stand out that, it really brought up something that, you thought this is, doing exactly the kind of work that you want it to, or that's having some kind of meaningful impact.
Oh, there's so many. Well, when it was shown in Lafayette, Louisiana, one of the Deepwater Horizon survivors was there. So
Oh.
that was really powerful. And that was a conversation that we both found ourselves in tears. Just, 11 people, 11 of his colleagues died in that horrible disaster. And then likewise, so many people just feel the need to come and explain it from their perspective, like what
Mm.
they saw. I mean, even just as like I'm having a conversation now about it, and I can smell the oil.
Mm.
Like it's just this burned in memory, and some of the sites that were so impacted. I'm happy to say a lot of those sites now are filled with baby fish. There is a lot of positive regrowth that's happened, a lot of species that are coming back. I mean, we still know that there's a lot of impact, but it's great to see areas like Grand Isle that were so damaged and other marshlands in Barataria Bay that just looked like they would never return, coming back to life, which is really fantastic. Not to say that that oil isn't still there and is still in the food chain and as a result inside of us.
Yeah.
Uh, but and another interesting thing is for young people to see it. So
Mm.
they've heard of the oil spill, but they were, born after the spill in some cases. So that's been really interesting. When we were showing it at the Galveston Art Center, there were several youth summer camps, and all those kids were born after the spill,
Yep.
but they'd heard of it. They'd heard of it, so it was a great way. And some of the stories that they told is like, wow, so oil went into the water, just acknowledging, and that same oil is how I got to class today. That kind of connection, and then it starts this conversation. Well, why are we using this if we know that it's so bad?
Mm.
And then it's, well, that gets a little complicated. Let's talk. And then I think those conversations happening with young people are exactly what we need to be doing, is like trying to make sure that these memories are not forgotten, that these ideas that we can move beyond just oil, we can move beyond just extraction, and to think of other modules of being, really need to start at an early age. So I'm very happy to talk to kids about oil spills.
I think it's
It's
also
great.
I think it's also really interesting because I mean, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, but those shrimp that were found, from shrimpers and shrimp markets that have the oil in them. And I think that's one of those places where, folks who maybe aren't as inclined in kind of their general thought process in the same way that you are, wanting to move past oil, but rather, continue to see a future in oil or work in oil and, and hope for its sustained future. We're here in Houston, which, loves to be the energy capital of the world and is very heavily invested in oil and gas in many, many ways. And a lot of people in town, if you were to say, here's a piece of art that's anti-oil and gas would write it off very quickly and arguably rightfully so because it's this is their livelihood and this is how they're approaching things. And so I commend you both on, I think, what you were saying earlier about, how do we frame these moments and think of them as holistic events and not try to just say, okay, here's the blame, here's the evil, here's the, the kind of polemic approach, but rather really thinking about how does this impact, the world around us? How does this impact us and those shrimp? I mean, the idea that especially being from New Orleans, right? Like everybody I know loves shrimp, has eaten a lot of shrimp. It is a mainstay. And seeing that and thinking, especially in this kind of tropic scaling that kind of happens, that I think a lot of the students that I've taken to the exhibit, quickly picked up on, and we're thinking about, oh right, there's relationships of animals that eat other animals, and just seeing, these kind of tiers made them think very much about, oh right, we're at the top of this food chain. Like even if I'm not particularly motivated by this event that happened before I was born, the idea that I'm consuming oil in some way, the idea that I am, that this oil, as you said earlier, is in me, I think really reframes that for them in a way of thinking about what are our responsibilities, to ourselves, even if I'm not invested in the animals and the plants and all these other things, but like this does actually directly bodily impact me. And that's not to say that they don't care about all these other elements, but I think even at the most selfish level, that's a kind of really powerful personal impact of, right, this is why all of these things, if I'm not innately driven to care about them, they do physically impact me. And I find that part of the work, or at least in having taken a couple of student groups to see it, actually, I mean, that was very clear from their responses, and I thought really impactful for them.
One of the similar to that idea of how you can connect people individually, at the end of the exhibition, um, in New York, I simultaneously worked with Dr. Benjamin Dubansky and Jack Rudlow in Florida. Ben Dubansky was here in Louisiana in Barataria Bay collecting grass shrimp for me.
Mm.
And then Jack was collecting grass shrimp in unoiled sites. And we did a comparison, of several hundred of them. And what we found is the specimens that were collected from the oil stain sites had almost every single one of them had some kind of deformity or abnormality.
Mm.
So huge statistical differences. So we preserved them all, and 500 of them we sent out to politicians and members, political people all over the US. And that was through the help of Feldman Gallery and his connections to the Democratic Party. But the Obamas got one, for example. So, and that was a way just to kind of present a very quick study that compared 688 grass shrimp to show these deformities happening 2 years later, even though it's sites
Mm,
that said that they were cleaned up, but there was obviously still oil there. But it was a way to really connect people that don't live in the region to the region again. And again, thinking through, as you said, seafood consumption, something that they're familiar with. But then I treated them in a way, I did what's called clearing and staining.
mm,
So I was able to take the shrimp, preserve them, make them transparent through digestive enzymes, and then stain some cartilaginous and connective tissue so they would kind of glow red and blue. So they kind of look like these beautiful little gems. So when people got them, they, assumed it was kind of decorative, and then there was a scientific paper that went along with it,
mm.
what the piece was, why they were receiving it, and the results. And so it was another strategy to kind of again connect people and get them to keep thinking about this.
Connected to that, just because you're mentioning that kind of the ways you can sometimes transform materials, I just want to highlight quickly. You also did a series of drawings out of oil. Can you talk a little bit about those or paintings maybe? But just that oil as a medium.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the challenges that I've been working on for years as an artist or just as a human being alive in this moment in history where we're suffering or we're in the middle of this biodiversity crisis, this huge extinction event, not just in the Gulf of Mexico, but all over the world, we're losing species so quickly, is how does one give form to something that's no longer there?
Mm,
And so I've created a lot of work around this idea of extinction and species loss, like the empty jars in collapse, even the clearing and staining process, somehow that makes the preserved organism look otherworldly or kind of not tangible anymore. So in the case of the crude oil paintings that you're talking about, um, literally what I tried to do is figure out a way to paint with the oil.
mm,
So I tried this in 2010 and 2011 in person with oil that I found on beaches, and inevitably I would do these drawings or these paintings, and they were always on watercolor paper, and they would, I'd be very happy with the result, and eventually they would just melt. So, I did photograph some of them, but they were not lasting. And what I wanted to do was once we started to really identify some of the missing species is to try to make paintings again. So during the pandemic, I was fortunate enough to have be able to get some oil that was used in a court case from Deepwater Horizon, as well as chemical dispersants, and I had a lot of time on my hands to experiment.
mm,
So over the course of the pandemic, I just built an outdoor laboratory and figured out the methodology to paint with crude oil. At the same time, a group that's working in Plaquemines Parish called Civilian was working to cap an oil spill that's ongoing there called the Taylor Energy Spill, which
mm,
actually started years before Deepwater Horizon and is ongoing today. So the Civilian group captures the oil, they then resell it, but they're keeping it out of the Gulf. And so they also gave me oil from that spill. So that was fresh versus kind of the thicker oil from Deepwater Horizon. And then I mixed the two together with the chemical dispersant, which then, if you paint with oil from a well, what happens is it goes on and then it continues to spread. It's like an oil spill on paper. But once the chemical dispersant breaks it apart, that corrects it, breaks it apart, it's heavier and it's a
mm,
bit more like wash. So it slows it. And then I used ethanol as like a rapid drying agent. And then essentially bake these pieces.
mm,
So what I did is I've created about a dozen of them so far, and they're ongoing. They just take weeks to make each because it's still oil and it's toxic. So I need to have the proper kind of safety gear to wear outside and also bake the pieces in the sun. So there's a series of them. They're in an exhibition called Breathe, which was at Rice University, where you're at the Moody Center recently. It's now headed to UC Davis, but it
Mm,
started at the Museum. And so there are five in that exhibition, and each is a portrait of one of the missing species. And the way that I was able to generate these portraits is I was an artist in residence at the Natural History Museum in the Smithsonian, the National Natural History Museum. And so they have most of the Gulf endemics in their collection, all prior to Deepwater Horizon. Some are very old, some are from the 1950s. And I photographed them and I x-rayed them. And then I was able to over time come back and make these paintings of each one. So each is kind of a portrait. Each is a way of kind of giving form to something that's absent currently in the hopes
mm,
that there's a sister species or a sister parallel series that goes with this. So these are crude oil paintings. There's another group that was recently in the GAC exhibition called La Mer des Enfants Perdus, which is in French, it's the sea of missing children, and they're generated from the X-rays of
mm,
the missing endemic species from the Gulf. And each X-ray is printed as a flag, so it looks like a pirate flag, with the intention of putting them on boats as we're looking for the missing species.
mm.
So there's kind of a positive and a negative. The positive being the ones that are created out of the oil itself, and then the negative are the X-rays that are these flags, which are meant more as a call to activism.
I want to we're rapidly running out of time here. But I want to shift just a little bit because I think something that's been really clear, especially in these, various projects you're talking about, is just that interrelationship between research and science, even science communication, and the art that you're making. And you open by describing yourself as a STEAM educator, which for folks who aren't familiar is STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, plus arts, right? And thinking very much about that role. And I would just love for you to get to chat just a little bit about that value of putting those together, because I think that just runs across, your whole overview of work in all regards. But, what do we get when we bring arts and science together in this way?
Well, I think one of the things that we really focus on at Atelier, which is driven from just years of doing this kind of educational or experiential activities or outreach, is trying to help people better understand how pragmatically to use the tools of science and technology to understand the world around them and within us, but also use the expressive tools of the arts to understand the world inside of us and outside of us. So
Mm,
the two, I think, are extremely complementary. None of us are strictly scientists and none of us are strictly poets. We're both. And it's a matter of just trying to think about, we've always said, oh, this person's more right-sided and this person's more left-sided. Well, there's some truth to that, but the reality is we make poetic and scientific decisions every day of our life. We learn through doing and we come up, it's like an experiment. How you're learning to walk, how you're learning to do these things. This is all like what the way that research happens is kind of understanding these models and then learning from them. So we do this naturally, but we are typically uh, asked to separate from one another and asked to kind of analyze in this way or participate in this way. And what we'd like to say is there's a much more holistic way of doing this.
yeah.
And in fact, need to be thinking about how we can solve complicated problems through more than one lens. I mean, none of the challenges, the socio-ecological challenges we face in the Gulf states and all over are not artistic problems, they're not scientific problems, they're much more complicated, and we need folks with different backgrounds thinking about it in different ways. And what I found is over the years is just the wealth of knowledge of place by so many people and learning from those people, but also giving them tools to help them express themselves to the change that they're seeing through the arts, I think is really, really vital. And then likewise, gaining a trust for science, realizing that science isn't something there to hurt them, but it's actually something there that we all need to understand, like how the world is changing around us and what tools we can work on to collaborate together so that hopefully we do continue. I think resilience is a complicated web of a word, but I would say adaptation
Yeah.
because a lot of the it's not as though people are not resilient. Coastal communities are not resilient, but they've been resilient for a long, long time. One of the big challenges is they're often not given the tools to adapt. So promoting adaptation, communication, and trust with one another, I think is vital at this moment in history. And I think it's happening. It's percolating in.
That's a great place. Yeah. Just also to hit on the fact that, I mean, I think that comes through all the work you're doing, especially around youth education at the Atelier. Um, Real quick, as we're heading out here, can you let folks know if they want to learn more about your work as an artist, as a biologist, as an educator? What are ways that folks can learn more about your work and maybe even see it or get involved in different ways?
Sure. Well, there are always exhibitions, but one of the easiest ways would be to go to my website. There's a mailing list. So it's brandonballengée.com, which is Brandon, Brandon, and then Ballengée. It's a Creole name for baker, Creole derivation of baker, which is Ballengee.com. And then if you come visit us in Louisiana, we're between Lafayette and Baton Rouge. We're in a place called Arnaville or Cecilia, Louisiana, off of I-10. We do free programs all the time. Join our mailing list there. Check us out on Facebook. And that's Atelier de la Nature, which is French for Nature's Workshop. Come visit. We have great food in this part of the country. And French is still very alive here. And yeah, you can follow us on Facebook, either with my studio page or with the Atelier page, and we'd love to have you come visit.
Well, thanks much, Brandon. I certainly want to go out there and have some boudin and paint some fish badly. And I hope to get out there soon.
Perfect. You'll be welcome whenever you come.
All right. Thanks much for talking with us.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Emin Rinchdorf. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.